Our guest is Bill Sanderson. Bill was a reporter for the New York Post for many years and now is an editor and writer for its fierce competitor, the Daily News. We'll ask him about that later. A few years ago, Bill got interested in the Kennedy killing and looked for an angle from which to write about it. He discovered, to his amazement, a big hole in the coverage. No one had written a book about the man who broke the story to the world, Merriman Smitty Smith, White House reporter for United Press International, who was riding in a reporter's chase car behind Kennedy's limousine. Bill has filled that void with his captivating 2016 tome, Bulletins from Dallas. As I wrote to you all in announcing this program, Smith was a reporter's reporter who went all out to get the story, whatever that entailed. He actually got into a physical fight with the AP reporter sharing the chase car with him over access to the radio telephone in the car. Smith also filed exclusive dramatic stories from Parkland Hospital and the plane where Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the next president. Smith won a Pulitzer for his effort, and writing about him gave Bill Sanderson a chance to look at all the reporting from what counts as one of the dozen most important stories of the 20th century. Bill, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I want to start by talking about one of the things I learned from researching the book, which is about the speed of news. One of the things I learned was that exactly how much faster news stories move today than they moved 6 decades ago. And I can put a number on it. The news today moves 4 minutes faster than it did in 1963. Now, I know this because on November 22nd, 1963, Merriman Smith and his colleagues at UPI needed just 4 minutes to put on the wire the news that John F. Kennedy had been shot. Kennedy was shot at 12:30 p.m. Dallas time, and UPI's first bulletin moved at 12:34 p.m. Now, you compare that to today, when news moves pretty much instantaneously on Twitter or some news app or some website or whatever. I think that today we've gone down from 4 minutes to 0. Now, one of the other things that have changed is that the days when newspapers were king and newspapers were Smitty's primary outlet, that's over. Nobody waits anxiously anymore for newspapers to be dropped from passing trucks. We're all looking at our phones. But the thing that hasn't changed is the need, I think, for the news business to have smart editors and smart reporters and smart writers. And that's what saved the day or made the day for UPI in Dallas on November 22nd. Merriman Smith is remembered by his friends as the greatest wire reporter ever. I heard that from some people who knew him. And how he scored this scoop about the Kennedy assassination is just a terrific yarn. I'm going to start with the night before Smitty left to travel to Texas with the White House press corps. I call him Smitty because I just, that's how his friends called him. That's what everybody knew him as, and I just sort of got used to that as I researched the book. Now, the night before Smitty left, he was not a happy guy. He had split from his wife. They're having a very ugly divorce. They feuded constantly about money. He was broke, and his bosses would not give him an advance for this trip because he was thousands of dollars behind in his expense reports. So he's sitting in his apartment and he's stewing about all of this. And he was so angry that he took a pile of the thank you notes and the praise notes and the goodwill letters that he'd gotten from his bosses and from UPI clients over the years, and he tossed them down the garbage chute of his apartment building. And then he wrote an angry memo to his bosses that said, "That's where this kind of crap belongs. That is how much it is worth." So this is his state of mind when he leaves the next morning to travel to Texas with Kennedy's entourage. One of the other things that you have to understand about Smith, though, is he left that he was a workaholic. He was all about being a reporter, and he was very highly skilled at it, and he had an awful lot of deep knowledge about the White House and how it worked. Now, UPI assigned him to the White House in 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor. By 1963, he'd been on the beat for 22 years with an interregnum here and there because he had a severe drinking problem and his bosses would send him away for a few months at a time. But he had long been considered the senior White House correspondent And he was the wire service reporter who ended news conferences for decades by saying, "Thank you, Mr. President," which was the title of one of his books. Now, he had sources everywhere in the White House, and they weren't all official. He knew the butlers, the gardeners, and all kinds of other people on the staff. And this irked Jim Haggerty, Dwight Eisenhower's press secretary. Actually, I think irked is a little too strong a word, because Smith had a good relationship with press secretaries he worked with. But Haggerty once said that Smith had so many White House sources, it was impossible to keep him from learning anything that was going on. So even though Smith was mad at his bosses that day, and even though he was mad at his wife, and he was mad enough at the world to throw all of those praise notes into his garbage chute, he was going to Texas. Now, there's a bit of silly pomp about the Texas trip. And one of the things is that on the morning of November 23rd, about 2 days in, the Kennedy entourage was in Fort Worth for a big Chamber of Commerce meeting there. It was a huge event. And afterwards, the president and his entourage headed for the airport to board a flight to Dallas. Dallas and Fort Worth are only about 30 miles apart. Why would you bother? The reason is that one of the purposes of the flight was to have TV cameras film the Kennedys' arrival in every Texas city. So the press plane arrived at Love Field in Dallas first, and then Air Force One came in. And this gave all the camera crews and the reporters and the photographers a chance to film this scene. Every time they landed at an airport in Texas, Lyndon Johnson was there to greet the Kennedys, and he greeted them as if it was the first time they'd ever been to the state. There were flowers presented to Jackie Kennedy. There's a big scene at the airport in Dallas that was covered in live TV. At Dallas, but also at Love Field, something happened that was key to, that tells you something about how Smith covered this story. Smith and some of the other reporters were left Love Field in what they called the wire car. It was a pool car. It was provided by AT&T. And inside the car were Merriman Smith from UPI, an AP reporter named Jack Bell, a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and a reporter for ABC News. Just those reporters were in the car, plus the driver, plus Malcolm Kilduff, who was Kennedy's deputy press secretary, and he was the press secretary on this Texas trip. Now, this car, because it was provided by AT&T because it was equipped with a radio telephone, and it was a two-way radio with a handset, a telephone-style handset, that it was connected by radio to the local telephone exchange. Now, one of Smith's things was he loved any kind of gadget that would deliver news faster, that would help him get his stories out quicker. So he always insisted on sitting in front by the radio telephone, which is, of course, the closest thing to a mobile phone that any of the 58 Washington reporters on the trip had. It was kind of a running joke among the other reporters. They thought it was kind of funny that Smith was so interested in sitting there, because he was usually the only reporter who wanted to use it. Now, Smith was the only UPI reporter from Washington in that day on this trip. UPI had a pretty robust bureau in Dallas, but Smith was the only Washington reporter on the trip. AP had two Washington reporters on the trip, Bell and the Bell, who usually covered Congress. He was kind of a political reporter and a congressional reporter. And they had the White House reporter, a guy named Frank Cormier. Now, when they got to Dallas, Frank Cormier decided he wanted to skip riding in the wire car for the motorcade through downtown Dallas. He preferred the sort of the collegiality of the press buses. And Jack Bell, the congressional reporter, was more senior than Frank Cormier. And Bell wanted to ride in the wire car because he wanted to get some color for a political story he thought he might write after the trip was over. So Frank Cormier, fine. He said Frank Cormier decided to ride in one of the press buses. So now it might have been that day, sometimes the AP and UPI reporters would trade off, sitting in front of the radio telephone. And maybe that day it was AP's turn to sit by the radio telephone. But Smitty got in the car, sat down in the middle of the front seat right next to the radio telephone, and Jack Bell didn't raise any fuss about it. Now, maybe Jack Bell didn't raise a fuss because he wasn't a White House reporter. He didn't know about this routine. And he just didn't see the importance of that Smith saw of being next to the radio telephone and thus being able to get out any news quicker than anybody else. The motorcade was a huge success. People forget this. There's a huge crowd in Dallas, and people were really excited to see Kennedy riding through the city in an open car with Jackie Kennedy, with the governor of Texas, with the governor of Texas's wife, with Lyndon Johnson. It was a huge show. And what happened in Dealey Plaza, the assassination, kind of happened at the end of the most intense part of the motorcade. As the motorcade was leaving downtown Dallas, heading into Dealey Plaza, Dealey Plaza kind of slopes downhill. There are three streets in the plaza, one in the middle of the plaza, two on each side, and they're kind of working a triangle, and they kind of converge under a set of railroad tracks. So the motorcade entered the middle of the plaza. It turned a sharp right, and then it had to turn left, a very sharp left, in front of the Texas School Book Depository. Now, Smitty's in the middle seat of the car, and he's sitting next to him in the passenger seat on the right is Malcolm Kilduff, the press secretary for the day. And Malcolm Kilduff looks at the Texas Book Depository building, and he says to Smitty, he turns and he says, "What the hell is a book repository?" He didn't read the sign right. Just then is when the shots came, just as the wire car passed directly in front of the book depository, and it was exactly 12:30 p.m. Now, one of the things about Smitty was he was kind of a gun nut. He liked shooting and hunting. He owned several firearms, and he knew what he heard. Some reporters thought the shots that they heard were vehicle backfire. Jack Bell, the AP reporter who was in the back seat of the wire car behind Smitty, he wrote that he thought the first shot was a giant firecracker. But Smith knew what he heard. He knew right away what it was. It was gunshots. The car slowed down a little bit as kind of the pandemonium unfolded 5 cars ahead of them in Kennedy's limousine. The reporters couldn't quite see what happened. They offered slightly different accounts of it later on in their reporting. But as Kennedy's limousine, as the driver of Kennedy's limousine stepped on the gas and zoomed away, Smith reached for the radio telephone right in front of him on the hump of the front seat of the car, and he got a call through to the UPI bureau in Dallas. Smith yelled, "Bulletin precede," which was wire service code for "I've got a news story and it's going to upend anything you have that's sitting there. Any B matter you have, throw it out. We're starting from the top here." Now, in the bureau, there was a rookie reporter, a guy named Wilborn Hampton, who I understand had a long career at the New York Times later on. He typed up Smith's dispatch, and he called out to his boss in the UPI bureau, a man named Jack Fallon. Now, Jack Fallon was also a New York area guy. He's from Westchester County originally, but at the time he was UPI's Southwest Division manager. And when Wilborn Hampton yelled this out, Fallon grabbed the phone, and Hampton showed him the dispatch that he'd just typed, Smith's words exactly. And Jack Fallon yelled to a teletype operator, "Send it." I hope you can see this. I have a copy of the original dispatch. It's now this is going to be a little tricky, but it's this top line here, and what it says is, Dallas, November 22nd, UPI, 3 shots fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. Not even a complete sentence, really. But this was the first dispatch that went out on the wire about the shooting, and it moved at there's a little timestamp on it, which was actually typed in by hand by the teletype operator, 12:34 p.m. Now, one of the interesting things, if you care about wire services and how they operate, is what was going on next. This is the actual paper this is a copy of the dispatch that UPI clients would have received. And at the top, there's right after that, the bulletin got sent up here. Someone in Chicago was trying to move a story about a murder trial that was going on in Minneapolis. Chicago was handling the copy for that story. And they wrote second lead, Thompson, Minneapolis. And then right away, the New York Bureau, which was UPI's headquarters, cut them off. Someone punched a key on the teletype machine and typed in bureaus, H-O, they spelled B-U-O-S, B-U-O-S, uphold, D-A, the code for the Dallas Bureau, it, yours, Y-R-S, they never spelled anything else, and then it was signed by the New York Bureau. A few seconds after that, the Atlanta Bureau came on, and they typed that they were going to run a correction, and all the Atlanta Bureau operator got on the wire was correct. And then New York jumped in again and said, bureaus uphold, or B-U-O-S uphold. Then the second lead, or I should say the first ad, moved to Smith's original dispatch down here, and it said, no casualties were reported. The incident occurred near the county sheriff's office on Main Street, just east of an underpass leading toward the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was to MA. Now, while that was going out on the wire, Smith crouched down with the radio telephone. He ducked under the seat under the dashboard of the car, because Jack Bell in the back seat was mad. Smith ducked down because he wanted to make sure his bureau could hear him. And later on, Wilborn Hampton said, we heard Smith perfectly. He was yelling into the phone. There was no problem hearing the guy. But Jack Bell was very mad, and he yelled, give me the goddamn phone. Well, Smith held on. As Kennedy's limousine heads towards towards Parkland Hospital, and the wire car followed on behind it. Now, Smith didn't know anything about Dallas, and he wasn't really sure where Kennedy's car was going. And then as that first ad to the story noted, they didn't think, the people in the car weren't sure if anybody had been hurt. Now, as the car sped off through Dallas, they seemed to be heading towards this place called the Dallas Trade Mart, which is a huge kind of a convention center where Kennedy was supposed to give a big luncheon speech. Now, maybe no one was hurt. They didn't know. And Smith and his editor, Jack Fallon, talked over what happened, and they were trying to get the facts right for the follow-up dispatches that Smith was writing. Smith said later that he had to hang on to the phone because even as Bell was punching him and hitting him and trying to grab the phone from him. And Smith said, on a story of this magnitude, I was not about to let it go until I knew the office had it all. Now, the wire car sped towards the Trade Mart, and the driver saw that Kennedy's limousine was up ahead, and it had passed the Trade Mart. And only when they went past the Trade Mart were the reporters sure something was wrong. Now, a few minutes after that, they were at Parkland Hospital, and they arrived at the hospital about 12:36 p.m., about 6 minutes after the shots were fired. So it was a pretty quick trip. Only then, after his pummeling from Jack Bell, does Smith give up the phone. He just kind of tosses the handset on the seat and jumps out of the car, and he runs up to the hospital emergency room entrance. Kennedy's limousine is parked right up in front of it, and Smith is able to run up there. So Bell fumbles around with the phone, but when he tries to call the AP's Dallas bureau he tries to get a through call to his editors in Dallas, the line mysteriously went dead. Nobody really knew why that happened. Some people at the AP thought that Smith tapped the phone's cradle and cut it off. but UPI always denied that, and no one ever really has really solved that mystery. So while Bell's fumbling with the phone, Smith and the other reporters who were in the wire car, they've jumped out. They run up to Kennedy's limo, which is just a few yards in front of them, right at the Parkland emergency room entrance. Now, Smith, the next day, in the story he wrote, which won a Pulitzer Prize, he told his readers everything that he'd witnessed. And he reported what he saw when he looked into the open top limousine. He reported the assassinate hit Governor John Connally, and he reported, and I'm going to read verbatim what he wrote. Governor Connally was on his back on the floor of the car, his head and shoulders resting on the arm of his wife, Nellie, who kept shaking her head and shaking with dry sobs. Blood oozed from the front of the governor's suit. I could not see the president's wound, but I could see blood spattered around the interior of the rear seat and a dark stain spreading down the right side of the president's dark gray suit. Now, Smith, as he's taking in this scene, this very gruesome scene, he turns to Clint Hill. Clint Hill was a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, and he was in a car behind the presidential limousine. But after the shots were fired, he ran forward. He ran forward and jumped on the running board of Kennedy's car and rode behind all the way to the hospital. Now, Smith knows all these guys. He knows all the Secret Service agents. So Smith says, "How bad was he hit, Clint?" Clint Hill answered, "He's dead, Smitty." I'm kind of amazed at how close Smith had come to this story. I mean, this is an example. This just shows you how close he was to what was going on. When Smith asked that question of Hill, the hospital litters hadn't even arrived yet. It took a little bit of time for the people in the hospital emergency room to realize that the president is shot in the head in a car out at the ambulance bay, and maybe we need to get out there. It didn't take long, but there's a beat. They missed a beat there. So after this, Smith runs into the hospital and he commandeers a telephone from a very startled emergency room clerk. He calls his bureau and he begins dictating to the bureau as Kennedy and Connally are wheeled into the hospital behind him. Now, in one of his follow-up dispatches, Smith quoted Secret Service agent Clint Hill by name and used the "he's dead" quote. While all this is going on, and while UPI is getting this out on the wire, the AP is just breaking down. It wasn't until 12:39 in the afternoon, 9 minutes after the shooting, that AP got its first bulletin about it on the wire. And that was based on a report from an AP photographer, a guy named James Altkins. And he, of all the journalists in Dallas that day, he was probably the closest one to Kennedy's limousine when Kennedy was shot. There were no mobile phones or anything. So what Altkins decided to do was to sprint back up the hill, back towards downtown Dallas, into his darkroom at the Dallas Morning News. And for some reason in Dallas, I haven't exactly determined, probably something to do with the rivalry between the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald. The AP's photographers in Dallas were based at the Morning News, and the AP's reporters in Dallas had a bureau inside the Times-Herald newsroom. So when Altkins runs back to the Dallas Morning News, he picks up a phone, which is a direct connection to the writers at the Times-Herald, and he starts talking to an editor there about what he'd seen. Now, AP moved this dispatch at 12:39 p.m., and it was 5 minutes behind UPI, but there was something worse about this. It only went to newspapers in the Western United States because the AP at the time was running its A-wire on a split. Newspapers on the Eastern United States it was past the deadlines for most afternoon papers. So AP at that time of day would run story budgets for things that they expected to provide the newspapers for the morning newspapers for the next day. But in the Western United States, west of the Mississippi River, the AP was still running breaking news. They were still running newspapers. They were still running reports for afternoon newspapers that were on the press that were on the presses in the Western United States at the time. And this was managed by the bureau in Kansas City. The Kansas City AP bureau sort of managed this split. And what had to happen was the bureau, as the dispatch got out from Dallas, someone in Kansas City had to see it. And they had to stop the transmission of all the budgets and put it on the wire in a way that would be seen by the East Coast newspapers. So the East Coast newspapers never got the first AP dispatch about the shooting until 12:40. It was 1:40 p.m. Eastern time, pretty late. And the other problem that the AP had was after this initial report, they moved some stuff that was really garbled by the teletype operators, who apparently were just not, they were moving things like, well, an example is the words he lay became he la. They just, a bunch of A's, a bunch of Z's. It was completely incoherent. And this went on for about 7, 8, 10 minutes that the AP was churning out copy that looked like this. And also they began making some mistakes. The AP wire reported in one of the sentences you could read, it said Bell, presumably Jack Bell, said Kennedy was transferred to an ambulance, but nothing like that happened. Now, Smith and Fallon and Jack Fallon, the guy in the Dallas bureau. By the way, Jack Fallon was one of AP. They were lucky that day at Dallas. Fallon was one of UPI's top people. He had helped them win a Pulitzer Prize. He'd helped the UP, the United Press, win a Pulitzer Prize in the 1950s for covering the Hungarian uprising. He was a rewriter. He was a rewriter in New York at the time, and he was one of the people who helped the UP win that. But they were turning out copy very steadily. And within a half an hour, they produced, by 12:50 p.m. In Dallas time, or 1:50 p.m. on the East Coast, they'd produced copy that was usable by afternoon newspapers. Now, I have an example of one of these papers here. This is a paper called the Portland Evening Express, published in Portland, Maine. It was an afternoon paper published the afternoon of the assassination. And this copy here is UPI's copy, pretty much verbatim. All this copy was sent by around 12:50 p.m. And that just shows you, I think, the quality of the work that UPI was putting out at that hour. They were putting out a very usable dispatch that an afternoon paper on the press, without any time to lose, could get out in front of its readers. And this includes the Clint Hill quote, "He's dead," in the 4th paragraph. And it also includes, Smith hedged it a bit. He said, well, other White House officials were in doubt, but this is what Clint Hill told me. I just think that's an example of really fine deadline writing by the UPI folks. Now, back in Dallas, meanwhile, the AP's woes of that afternoon were just getting started. Jack Bell was stewing all afternoon about not having gotten to be able to use the wire telephone. And he said later on, I should have yanked the goddamn phone out of its socket. But he had another problem, which was that he was not a White House reporter. So he wasn't picking up on some of the cues that were necessary, that he needed to have to cover the story that was unfolding in front of him. One of those cues was he didn't realize that when the White House was pulling together a press pool, for reasons the White House would not state, he needed to go along. Now, the other White House reporters who were pulled into this pool knew right away, the president wants you for a pool, come with us. If this is what they heard from White House aide, they went. They didn't ask a question. But Jack Bell was working on kind of a first-person story about what he'd seen already. He was tapping it out on a portable typewriter, and he just said, "I'm busy. I don't need to go." When the White House aides went to Merriman Smith, though, they said, "We need you for a pool. The president is leaving Dallas." Smith knew two things. He knew that when they said the president is leaving Dallas, they were talking about Lyndon Johnson. And when they told him they needed him for a pool, he knew, go. You don't ask questions about this the way Jack Bell did. They went to the White House went to Jack Bell at least twice and said, "Please come with us." And Jack Bell said no. He was the only AP reporter in the hospital. He was the AP reporter at the scene. He was the guy they expected to go. He said no. So the reporters, Merriman Smith and two other reporters, left for Love Field without anyone from the AP. Now, Merriman Smith and the two other reporters were the only three reporters to witness Johnson's swearing in when Johnson took the oath of office in that famous photograph taken aboard Air Force One. Smith was there. A guy named Sid Davis, who was a reporter at the time for Westinghouse Broadcasting, was there, and a man named Chuck Roberts, who worked for Newsweek, was there. No one from the AP was present when that happened. Now, the story of the fist fight in the wire car of Jack Bell reaching over from the back seat into the front and pummeling Smith in his back might have never come out until, except for a column in the New York Post that ran about a month later on December 18th. It was a column by Leonard Lyons, who was a gossip columnist of the day, maybe the leading gossip columnist of the day. And probably Smith leaked this tidbit to Leonard Lyons in person, because the column ran a day after Smith was in New York City on a presidential trip with Lyndon Johnson. So this made Jack Bell very mad when he heard about it. And a few days after this column ran, a few days after the assassination, on December 23rd, a month after the assassination, Jack Bell put a piece of Associated Press letterhead in a typewriter, and I'm not sure I have the rights to this, but this is the part of Jack Bell's letter. And he wrote a very angry note to Merriman Smith about what happened. And he wrote, "Dear Smith," because, didn't want to call him Smitty, so he called him Smith. "Dear Smith, I think you've milked this for about all the personal publicity you can get out of it. I'm getting a little tired of this crap about how I pummeled you, and you have the bruises on your back to prove it. Also about the world beat that you got, which doesn't seem to have showed up on the wires. Now you add a Philip that I never even got the radio telephone." And this just sort of goes to the state of mind that Jack Bell had about the assassination pretty much for the rest of his life. When Jack Bell died he died, I think it was in 1975, his official AP obit did not mention anything at all about the fact that he had been in Dallas and he'd been the AP's reporter on the scene. Now, the AP made a bunch of other mistakes on the day of the assassination. They wrongly reported that Lyndon Johnson had been wounded. They wrongly reported that President Kennedy's parents learned of the assassination from a workman at the Kennedy compound, and none of that was true. And I think that in my research about this, I decided that Jack Bell's bosses rationalized the AP's stumbles that day. They sort of glossed them over. Bob Johnson, the AP's bureau chief, and he was the guy who wrote the initial dispatch that was phoned in by James Altkins. He said later on that he thought that the AP was right on in its coverage of that day. But not only was the UPI copy more accurate, its bulletins mostly moved ahead of the AP. Even when UPI moved its dispatch flash, President Kennedy dead, they were 2 minutes ahead of the AP with that flash. One of the reasons they were 2 minutes ahead was Jack Bell was pecking away at his portable typewriter, trying to write his first person story. And I can't determine this exactly, but I don't think anyone from the AP was in the room at Parkland Hospital when Malcolm Kilduff announced the president's death. There was an AP photographer there for sure, but I don't think the AP had any reporters there. And the photographer, sensing that he not seeing any writers in the room, he ran out and told Jack Bell and said he's dead. And Jack Bell picked up a telephone and told the photographer to call that news into the office. So one thing I think I want to say this in favor of Jack Bell is that unlike his bosses, he never rationalized this. He understood exactly what had happened. He understood that he had screwed up, and I think that speaks well of the guy. And he had if it wasn't for the assassination, I think he did have an excellent career as an AP reporter, but it just went pretty badly for him and for all of his colleagues that day. There's a lot more to this. I can answer any questions anybody has. Happy to talk about the book and the things that happened that day.
Myron Ruzhetsky asks, was the wire car a vehicle that traveled with the president wherever he was, or was it provided locally? And was the wire car also provided locally, or was that something that was transported to Dallas?
I don't think it was something they transported to Dallas. I didn't dig into that question. I know that it was provided in Dallas by AT&T, and I think that they just had different. I think they had different vehicles in different cities. It wasn't a car that was owned by the government or the White House.
Yeah. And David Margolick asks, so Smith saw the president's body sprawled in the car before he was taken to the hospital?
Absolutely right. He did see this.
When did he go off the Love Field for the Johnson inauguration?
All right. This happened an hour or so after Kennedy's body had been removed from the hospital.
So Smith was there when he was declared dead.
Smith was at Parkland Hospital when Kennedy was declared dead, and he attended that news conference that I think the AP missed, in which Malcolm Kilduff announced the death. Smith was at that news conference. After that announcement of the president's death, that the White House put together the pool that Jack Bell failed to attend.
The initial dispatches from UPI were written at headquarters by a rewrite man, right?
They were written in Dallas by Jack Fallon. They were not in New York. The initial dispatches were written in Dallas by Jack Fallon. And I think UPI, knowing Fallon's history, Fallon was one of their best people. I don't think there's any effort that I've heard of to kind of call the story back out of Dallas while Fallon was working on it.
Smith won the Pulitzer for a longer wrap-up story that he wrote later.
That's correct. He won the Pulitzer for a story that ran in papers the next day. He wrote that story after he got back to Washington that night. And I think it's really an excellent piece of deadline reporting, very straightforward, really well written. And it wasn't one of the things there's a story back, I think it was around 1998 in AJR, the Journalism Review magazine. It was by Patrick Sloyan. And Sloyan wrote that Smith's editors never touched the copy. They put in the paragraph breaks, and that was it. They didn't need to do anything else with it because one of his editors said, you have to know when to leave your copy, when to leave the copy alone. You have to know how to leave it alone. They left Smith's copy alone that day. And I reported that in the book off of what Sloyan wrote. After the book came out, I found out from the son of one of the editors in the UPI bureau in Washington that was in fact true, and that he had a copy of this. He had the original copy that Smith had filed stored away somewhere. And I didn't get too much further into the story than that.
As an editor, I resent that it didn't require any editing. I mean, that's unheard of. David Andelman has something to say about AP versus UPI that day.
Right.
David, go ahead.
I'm here. Yes, thank you. But this is quite fascinating. I'm particularly interested in AP versus UPI that day because, as it happens, the day that Kennedy was assassinated, I was the news director of WHRB, the Harvard student radio station, which was, of course, the Kennedy radio station, as it were.
Right.
Yeah. So I heard about this when one of my interns was racing across the quad at Quincy House shouting, "Kennedy's been assassinated." And I was en route to get my monthly allergy shot in Boston. So I scrapped that, went straight down to the network, and we began work that day. Now, WHRB was a UPI shop. We were 100% UPI. We had no other teletype, no other ticker in the newsroom. The Harvard Crimson, however, was an AP shop. They had no UPI ticker in the newsroom. So we were substantially ahead virtually the entire day and the next day of the Crimson. Not that would have mattered because the Crimson, of course, put out simply one edition a day. I guess the first day it put out a couple of editions, but we were on the air constantly. What was interesting, though, that after the first day or so, we became hooked up with NBC News, NBC Radio, particularly in New York. And we did an agreement with them where they could take all of our feed. We could take any and all of their feed. Now, they, of course, had access to both AP and UPI. But most of when we were on the air, we were basically a UPI shop. And that really, I think, worked remarkably well for us. We had a lot of people tuning in, not only from the Harvard campus, but we were on an FM station as well as a closed circuit AM station for the Harvard community. We were an FM station for all of the Boston, New England area. And we got quite a lot of listenership that day from folks who were interested in seeing what the, shall we say, Harvard perspective was. But it was very interesting that first day just to follow we didn't really know what AP was saying, but we did have a sense from the other radio stations that in many cases we were ahead of them because we did have the UPI ticker, the teletype.
One of the interesting things, and I go into this somewhat in the book, is that the UPI's radio and TV stations were served by a separate wire.
We had UPI radio wire. Yes, we had the UPI radio wire.
Right. And one of the things that happened that day was the copy from UPI's radio wire was written in Chicago. UPI had a staff of people in Chicago who wrote all that stuff. They took Smith's copy and rewrote it in radio. So I talk about that a bit in the book.
I'm kind of surprised that Dallas did not have a radio wire there that they could go onto the main national radio, cut in the main national radio wire from Dallas.
There was a radio wire based in Chicago, and they controlled that wire for 40 minutes of every hour. And then for 20 minutes of every hour, they ceded control of the wire to local circuits.
Right, the split, yeah.
The split. And so one of the things that happened in the Kennedy assassination was the news apparently broke while the radio wire was on one of these splits. The national desk had ceded the wire to local stations, and then this news broke at exactly that time. So the radio wire in Chicago, the people had to get on the wire, and they kind of screamed in wire services. They yelled, they would type up, "Get off, get off, get off, get off." The best they could do to get the radio reporters in Dallas and Des Moines and wherever else the radio writers were to get off their local circuits because they had really important national news to transmit.
Of course, we got our radio wire, UPI radio wire, from the New England radio desk in Boston.
Right.
It is quite possible. I mean, I don't know what happened inside the Boston bureau. It was led by a guy named Henry Minot in those days, who was just really he was a crackerjack UPI guy, and I'm not sure if he didn't actually demand that. In fact, he might very well have taken that off of the A wire and put it straight onto the New England radio wire, which is why we saw it so quickly. I mean, that's entirely possible. I don't know.
I think they were pretty quick in Chicago, but maybe. Chicago controlled it nationally, so.
Alan?
Yeah, hi. Bill, when I was I started as a reporter at the Washington Star in 1973, 3 years after Smith had died.
Right.
But one of the first things that they did when I got off the plane from the Anchorage Daily News was to take me to the White House and show me around the press room. And I can't remember which one of the old vets of the Star, whether it was Bernie Boston, the White House photographer, or Jack Germond, the political writer, or Jeremiah O'Leary, the all-time, sort of inside Washingtonian guy, told me a slightly different story about being in the car with Merriman Smith. And the story that I had heard was that after he had talked to his desk and dictated, and he was being pounded by Bell, that he ripped the phone out of the dashboard and handed it to Bell and said, "You want the phone? Here's the goddamn phone." Did you ever hear that story?
I never heard that story. I've heard versions of the story that say Smith hit the cradle of the phone and thus cut it off. But other people say that's apocryphal. Helen Thomas said it was apocryphal. I think I never heard it quite that way. I've heard people say Smith cut him off, but I've never heard it done quite that way. I don't think Smith cut him off, but at this point, that just has to be my opinion.
Well, you said the phone went dead, so
right, it did. It could have gone dead for a number of reasons. The radio telephone sometimes was staticky. There could have been a lot of radio traffic going on that channel that might have prevented him from getting through. There were a lot of things that could have gone wrong.
Joe Berger has a question.
Two questions. First of all, I think most of the public associates the bulletin about Kennedy's death with Walter Cronkite.
Yes.
Was that a portent of the changeover from newspapers to television for breaking news, or how do you see that? And that's my first question. The second question is, how did you get so interested in this particular topic?
Also, I assume Cronkite used the Merriman Smith bulletin, right?
Yes, he did. Cronkite, he was an old United Press person. So, and he read Smith's bulletin when he went on the air that day. I don't know if I'm really equipped to talk about what this has to do with the ascendancy of TV news. I know that it was the first time TV went wall to wall with a story. They just started covering something, for a while, for 24 hours. But I talked a bit about Cronkite in the book and what happened, but I think a little more in relationship to his reporting that day. And I just think it was kind of interesting. One of the things that happened was Cronkite, his first bulletin, which Cronkite and CBS got on the air right away. They were quicker about this than NBC and a little quicker than ABC. But he was definitely first with it. And when he first put the news on the air, he had to do it from what they called an announce booth, because there was no camera warmed up in the newsroom. It took about a half hour, I understand, for these cameras to warm up, and there just wasn't one ready. So he had to do. They put a slide. They put up a slide that said CBS Bulletin, and then Cronkite read the news over the slide.
I had to do the same thing when the Pope was shot. Pope John Paul was shot. I was in the newsroom there. They did not have the it's called the hot camera hot, and I had to go in a booth over a slide and read that. And they said, make sure you attribute it to United Press, because that's what it was.
ABC, at least, I don't know when it started. I thought it started after the Cronkite bulletin. All the networks now have a hot camera all the time for that reason.
Right. That's right.
Why did you get so interested in this particular topic? How the wire services broke the story?
I guess I was just always fascinated by I was fascinated by it for many years. I read the article that Patrick Sloyan wrote in AJR back in the late 1990s, and it really made an impression on me. And in 2013, I'd been bought out by the New York Post. I was unemployed and scratching around, figuring out what to do next. And an editor at the New York Observer called me up and asked me to write a piece about the anniversary of the assassination. It was 2013, so that would have been the 50th anniversary. And that just sort of gave me a chance to kind of start digging in. So I dug into it and luckily found an agent and a publisher for the book.
With all your research, did you, and for that matter, did Merriman Smith believe that Oswald was a lone shooter?
Merriman Smith resolutely hated the conspiracy theories. He said, I was there. I heard 3 shots. They came from behind me. They came from behind me over to my right, and I know what happened. That's it. The other thing about Merriman Smith is he was resolutely a creature of the Washington establishment. The Warren Commission was made up of people that he knew or was familiar with, and he respected them and he respected their work. But also, I think I wrote a chapter about all this in the book. He was very aware of the conspiracy theories, had read up on all of them, knew what all of them said, and was ready happy to debunk them. And he wrote a long story once, a freelance piece for the Washington Post, picking apart all the conspiracy theories, talking about why they were wrong and why he didn't believe them. Another interesting thing that Smith did was he took a trip to New Orleans to report on the case brought by the Orleans County
Garrison.
It was Harris, yes. And Smith spent some time looking into that whole situation and decided that it was just a load of bunk. He didn't buy anything that Garrison was putting out. Just didn't believe any of it, and wrote a very long story for UPI that was featured by many of its client newspapers, talking about how Garrison and the other theories, and he didn't buy it.
Bill, we have a bunch of Times people in the club.
Yes.
And 2 of them ask what the role of the Times was, and particularly Tom Wicker.
He did a good job that day, but he wasn't as close to the story as Merriman Smith. He was on one of the press buses, and he admitted that he had very little firsthand reporting for the situation. As they wheeled Kennedy's casket outside of Parkland Hospital, Wicker saw that, and he saw Jackie Kennedy walking alongside the casket with her hand on it. And he said later that was about the only firsthand information he really got that day. But he wasn't alone in that. There were, he was among 58 White House reporters on that trip, and none of them got closer to the situation than Merriman Smith.
Nadine Brosen asked the question.
I was very curious why your concentration was totally on wire service and not on other forms of the media. And I do remember what a great job Tom Wicker did. So I was curious about that.
One of the things that struck me about this was that we had a lot of Washington reporters in those days. There were 58 of people 58 Washington reporters on that trip, and most of them were newspaper people. How many newspapers cover the White House? Daily newspapers would cover the White House that way today. I think the Washington Post would, and I think the New York Times would, and I think that's really it. The Wall Street Journal, of course. That's it. But there were papers on that trip. There was a reporter from Kansas City. There were reporters from Louisville. There was a reporter from Oklahoma City. Those were the kinds of papers that had White House reporters in those days who would travel with the president. And nowadays, not so much.
Bill, talk to us about print journalism in the time of the internet.
One of the things I learned researching the book was how much entertainment newspapers were expected to provide back in the 1960s. And I learned this by looking through old daily newses from the time of the assassination. The Daily News was loaded up with comics and little pencil puzzles and crosswords and mazes and stuff for your kids to do. And, gossip and movie reviews and TV reviews and all kinds of things that the newspapers have had to cut back on in the present day. for a large reason, because you get it somewhere else. I don't pretend to know what's going on, what's going to happen to print. I know that in my own publication, they're very interested in maintaining it. The Daily News is going to be in print for as long as the owners can keep it going that way. They don't want to cut it down, cut it back, or shut it off.
Can you buy one in your neighborhood, whatever neighborhood that is?
Yeah, I live in the Upper West Side. I can get one here.
Well, of course, you mentioned you're not in the newsroom. Is anybody
That's true.
in the newsroom?
We don't have a newsroom right now, so we're all waiting to see how that shakes out if we get a new one.
How is the Daily News doing?
I'm not privy to all the stuff that's going on as far as its finances or the economic situation the paper's in, but I think here we are. You can read it and I think judge it for yourself. That's about the best I can say.
I don't want you to tell any state secrets.
We're staffed all day. We don't have anybody overnight anymore, but we're on the streets from 7 in the morning till midnight. It's not the 1980s. It's not 1985. Resources the resources are not as abundant, but we're still around, and we're still trying to do what we can to cover the city.
Congratulations on your book. I know it's a bit late for congratulations. I hope it's still selling. Some of us will buy a copy now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.